Welcome, everybody. We're really glad to have everybody that's coming in right now to join us. I'm sure a few more people might be logging in just as we get started here, but I want to welcome you all. I'm Joshua Castano. I'm the Director of Community Engagement Services at the organization Partners for Sacred Places, and we're really grateful for this opportunity to be part of today's presentation that the SEEP Network has organized. Partners is a national nonprofit that is focused on the stewardship of historic buildings. We'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Today's webinar is focused on managing empty buildings in the era of COVID-19. This is going to be an interesting and hopefully very helpful topic for everyone that's able to log in with us today. You'll notice that there is a chat box if you're familiar with Zoom, and if you're not, at the bottom you'll see that there is a little icon that says chat. Throughout the presentation, we'll be using slides and also sharing information on a number of the topics that are part of today's presentation. At the end, we will have about 15 minutes for question and answer. So please use the chat box to share your questions, and we'll use that chat box at the end to see what everybody has been thinking and take our questions from there. So please make sure to use that throughout the time that we're presenting. So thanks again, everybody that's here. Like I said, I'm Joshua Castano from Partners for Sacred Places. I'd like to introduce Robert Yeager, who is Partners co-founder and president from Partners. Bob, would you like to say a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Joshua. I'm Bob Yeager. I've been around with Partners since its founding in 1989. So it's been 31 years. It's been exciting to do all this good work over the years. We never thought we'd be facing something quite like this before. So we're really happy to be joining Jim and Bruce today. So thank you.
So next I'd like to introduce Jim Shepard, who's a principal of and preservation architect and has actually experience working at the National Cathedral. Jim, would you like to say a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. Thank you for the introduction, Joshua. So I am historic preservation architect with about 25 years of experience. I just recently joined Smith Group, actually, because I was formerly at the Washington National Cathedral as their Director of Preservation and Facilities. So I know a lot about caring for big old buildings, and particularly churches. And I've carried that forward to Smith Group now to address a whole range of other historic buildings. And I actually have, believe it or not, a lot of experience in dealing with mothballing historic buildings. So that'll be an interesting overlay to the conversation we have today.
Thanks so much, Jim. And of course, I'd love to introduce us to Bruce Smith, who's at St. Martin's Parish in Houston, where he helps oversee facilities. Bruce, would you like to say more about yourself?
Sure, Joshua. Thank you for having invited me to this. I'm St. Martin's here for 9 years. I came here to retire and ended up working a whole lot harder than I ever had anyplace else, and taking care of about 14 acres of campus here. And in looking forward to this presentation and listening to what people have to say about empty buildings.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Bruce and Jim. And as I mentioned, I'm from Partners, and my background is in historic preservation. I happen to actually also be an Episcopalian, a practicing Episcopalian, as it were, although I've been about a month out of practice, I'd say, not having the chance to be in my own parish church, but I'm the secretary of the vestry at St. Mark's Church in Philadelphia on Locust Street. So I always mention that because I think it's helpful to know that when we're speaking to this, while Partners has some national experience and many years of work in this field, personally, I bring the experience of being a vestryman to this conversation. So I know what it's like when the bills need to get paid and the checks need to be signed and you need to hire architects and contractors. So thanks. Well, I'd like to turn it over to Bob to get us started, to take us away. And while he gets us started, I'm going to share some slides with us, which are really just to help continue us and continue focus on our conversation today.
Great. Thank you, Joshua. And thanks for getting the PowerPoint started. I think what we are all in agreement on is that we want to continue the life of the church at a time when civic leaders are telling us to be careful and to be safe and only do what is most essential. And I think finding that balance, how do we safeguard our buildings? How do we communicate that we're alive and that we're well and we're still doing our best to serve the community? And how do we engage our community and maybe even do some new things in this time? I think those are some of the questions that we want to talk about today. So how do we continue the life of our parishes and keep our buildings cared for and maybe even used to some extent at the same time we're being careful and safe and doing what's most essential? Just a quick word about Partners for Sacred Places. Joshua said a little bit before, we've been around for 31 years, and we've, over that time, tried to make a real case for the importance of our parishes and our buildings, not just to our parish life, but also to the larger community. So we try to make a case for their value as buildings that define the streetscape, that have some of the best craftsmanship and artisanry in our neighborhoods, that capture the history of our communities, and have an economic effect. And we like to say that sacred places are civic places too. They're not just places for worship and Sunday school and fellowship, but they're places that really serve the larger neighborhood. And I think setting that context first, as we think about what do we do now, can be helpful. So I want to just quickly point to a study we did that's on our website, by the way. You can download the entire study that we published a couple of years ago on what we call the halo effect of sacred places, meaning what is their larger impact on the community. And this pie chart kind of captures a little of that, which is that your average urban church or synagogue brings a value, an economic value to the community of about $1.7 million a year. And of course, that's when it's fully used and lots of things are happening. So obviously that's changing right now, but I think it's still an important fact that we want to put out there, is that these are places that should matter, not just to our parish, but to the larger community. Next slide. And one other thing that I think you'll find interesting as we talk about how we take care of these buildings in this time and how we might use them. Normally, we've learned in the study we did with the University of Pennsylvania is that almost 90% of the people we serve in our sacred places over the course of the year, almost 90% are not our members. And this is part of the larger conversation that I think is relevant to today's webinar, which is these are public places, they're civic assets, and they serve the larger community. And so as we try to take care of them and think about their use and talk to our mayors and our foundations and our business leaders, we have to think in civic terms and not just in terms of parish. I also want to, before I turn it over to my colleagues here, just to note a little bit of what we've learned in a survey we did recently. It was during Holy Week, and of course we're all dealing with the pandemic, so we want to do more of this and get more results. But what's interesting from the data we got back from the survey is that even if clergy and other staff are not in the buildings much anymore, 2/3 of parishes are still keeping custodial staff on site. And this is relevant to what Jim and Bruce will talk about in a moment, which is keeping an eye on our buildings and taking good care of our buildings at a time when not much is happening. So interestingly, for 2/3 of our parishes, the custodian's still there. Worship may still be recorded there or filmed there. Of course, people are not coming in for worship, but it may be where we're still actually capturing the worship service, maybe some of the music, certainly the homily, and then live streaming it. And interestingly also, most of these buildings are no longer hosting the kind of community outreach that they used to host. And so a lot of what churches have done to serve the community is not happening on the site anymore, but yet clergy are keeping track of where it is happening, which is really interesting and important, that a rector or the priest in charge may still be talking to the people running the childcare center that's now dislocated, or the food program that's now, in limbo. So they're aware that these programs are maybe without a home. They're keeping an eye on that. Of course, they'd like to bring them back as soon as they can. But for the moment, many of these programs are no longer finding a home in the parish building. So I think this is really kind of relevant and helpful to talking more about, well, how do we take care of these buildings and make the most of them and lift them up to the community at a time when we can't fully occupy them.
Bob, if I can jump in here, I think one of the most interesting things about the information we're gathering from congregations across the country, but also in light of the economic halo effect of parishes, is this somewhat sad or interesting fact, it depends on how you look at it, that there's so much work happening in an average church building and facilities over the course of the week. So many programs that, from feeding programs to AA and NA type programs, a whole range of community serving activities, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, etc. I mean, you can have a list of thousands of names on it, but all of these kinds of uses that really are, in some cases right now, in abeyance, or trying to figure out where they're going to meet, how they're going to meet because they can't meet in person. And I think what that means is an opportunity for churches to remind their community and their parishioners about the value that they bring by hosting and welcoming all of these community uses. Sometimes it's hard for us to see what we have until we've lost it, so to speak. And hopefully none of these things are lost in the long term, of course. Everything will return to a new form, if not necessarily exactly what it was before this crisis. But we have hope that all of this stuff will come back. But I think this is a very good time to remind parishioners and the community about all the ways that your buildings welcome and serve by the many hundreds and thousands of people that come through them every week to do things that have very little little to do with worship on Sunday morning or Bible study or vestry or choir, etc., but really are about serving people's needs and the vitality of the community. So I think that's an opportunity to, when you're communicating, and we know that communication is a really important part of how we're all going to survive and thrive during this period of crisis, that when you're communicating and staying in touch and engaging with the wider community, to remember that, to remind them of the way that you add value by keeping your building open and sharing space. So of course we want to talk about what to do more specifically with buildings that are closed. And I think what might be really helpful here is, in some cases a building might be entirely closed, but what's really driving our change is the need to prevent large-scale gatherings and lots of personal contact, which of course could contribute to the spread of the disease. So it might be more helpful, while it's easy to say close buildings, entirely or partially closed buildings, we really want to think the building is not necessarily closed in the sense that in the same way that a completely vacant building might be. It may be mostly closed because those programs, those activities can't happen there. And that may just be a language thing, but I'd like to put that out there to help us keep track of where we're thinking and how we're thinking about this, and also pay a little bit of attention to the way we communicate with others about it. Of course, though, without lots of people in these buildings, a new set of challenges and questions arise. And those are the ones that we especially are looking for James and Bruce to help us consider and think through. Keeping buildings safe when they're not being used is important. Preventing unwanted intrusions, unwanted visitors or guests from sneaking into those buildings is important. But also remembering things like repair and maintenance projects, which don't go away. A building still has needs. A building's maintenance and repair and capital issues are still there. And in some cases, you may have already been in the midst of a capital or maintenance project before this crisis. And we do know that throughout the country, there's a range of situations where in some places, like here in Philadelphia, construction is not really an allowed essential use, but in other places, like in Texas, it is. So in some municipalities and states, construction is allowed to proceed while it isn't in others. So that may affect your particular situation. But the other thing is there may be some potential or temporary uses, as Bob hinted earlier in this presentation. You may not be able to use it in the normal, quote unquote, normal ways that, or typical ways that you've been accustomed to, but what might be some of the unique opportunities? This is a period of great creativity. I think the best thing that we can all do in light of what we're facing is to be as creative as possible. And that means changing. Everything is sort of out the window in some ways. So think differently. Think about what some of the different kinds of partnerships that might be opened up in your community. And of course, and this is partly because of our set of principles and mission here, is that you really need to make sure that you're still communicating with the community. Your building may seem closed, but your parish isn't closed. You're not closed. You're still very much open for business, a very different kind of business. It's going to have a very different look, but you're still around and you're still doing what you need to do as a community that is mission-driven and focused. So I'd love if Jim could step in here and kind of lead us through some of the more important topics around safeguarding and keeping the building in good repair in the midst of a strange situation like this, where it is almost like a vacant building.
Well, thanks, Joshua. I should have mentioned in my introduction that I too am an Episcopalian and have served on a vestry and have led many building and grounds committees for many years. So, and I transitioned that obviously into being the director of facilities at the cathedral for 7 years. So I'm well aware of the many needs of our buildings and the shortage of resources oftentimes to take care of them. And particularly these times, that's extremely important. So as we sort of step away from being regular users of our building, the building still is standing there trying to weather the storm as weather rolls through, and you still end up getting roof leaks and all those other things, whether you're in your building or not. So I think one of the things, the terms I mentioned earlier was mothballing. So as a historic preservation architect, it's pretty common when you have a building that's not occupied to what they call mothball it, which means look at ways and to make sure that the building envelope is secure, to secure your doors and windows, to make sure there are no leaks, and to make sure that no one can get in the building, but also to maintain some level of consistent temperature control on the inside. And while I think the term mothballing is a little bit different than where we are now, there are a lot of similarities between the techniques that are recommended for that. And I think one of the resources actually that we'll share with you, the National Park Service does have a preservation brief, brief 41, that actually gives some really good outlines about what to do with your buildings if you were to mothball them. Now, again, I say it's not directly relevant, but a lot of the things that they outline, such as maintenance schedule, if you're not regularly in your building, things to check on, are really important, just so that you're keeping an eye on your building while you're not using your building. Obviously, one of the highlights is to make sure that your fire and life safety systems are functioning, because while we are not present in our churches regularly now, in the follow-up of we're coming on a year past Notre Dame burning, it's really important to make sure that while you're not in the building, you know what might be going on in the building to make sure you're protecting it. And I would say, obviously, one of the highlights is to make sure that your building systems are running, making sure that your HVAC systems, mechanical systems are running, but that they are on a schedule so that you're not consuming energy you don't have to. So, you know, now's the time to retool your controls and think about the duration your systems are running, making sure that you're as energy efficient as possible. But, you know, for things like your organ and other things that are inside your sanctuary while they're not being used, it's important to make sure that you're maintaining some level of controlled humidity and temperature control, particularly as we shift from spring into summer. And it looks like this COVID circumstance is going to stretch into the summer and means that we're going to have to shift from heating to cooling. You want to make sure those things are consistent. You know, I also think Joshua mentioned unwanted intruders, and that's not just people. It's also insects and pests. So, you know, those are the things that you tend to forget when your building is empty. The critters want someplace to live, and they're looking to get out of the weather and into your church. So important to make sure that you're controlling that. You know, another thing too is when you mothball a building or step away from it for a stretch, some of the simple things like making sure you took the trash out. Some people forget about that. You sort of walk away from your building and forget that the regular things you normally have a cyclical set of resources to take care of might have been forgotten. And those things actually attract the pests that might want to come in and lunch on your garbage and hang out in your building. So those are important things to think about. Also, as I mentioned, just making sure that there's a regular policing of the outside of your building from a maintenance standpoint. Some eyes on, the windows, the roofs, the doors, and then if possible, making sure that somebody's doing the same thing on the inside on a weekly basis, just so that you're checking on both the systems and also the visual cues that your building might have some issues.
So, Jim, I just want to point out, in terms of unwanted visitors, the church that's depicted here is Emmanuel Presbyterian in Albuquerque, New Mexico. They're good friends of ours and clients of Partners. And their pastor discovered within about the first week or two of the sheltering in place orders in New Mexico that a person experiencing homelessness had made their way into the property. Of course, the want to help people who don't have shelter find a safe place where they can remain healthy and stay away from possible infection is important. But having that kind of situation is not really useful, and it's not good for the building, and it's not good for other people. So that's it's real. It's a very real possibility that can happen there. Jim, I just wanted to ask you if you had any thoughts, and especially Bruce here, some parishes may have to scale back some of the time for their maintenance staff, or they may still have property committees, but everybody is trying to stay at home as much as possible. On that human side of the issue, what are some thoughts that come to mind about how they can troubleshoot that?
Well, we rotate individuals in each week. We have usually one maintenance individual and one or two housekeeping individuals that come in and go through all of the facilities almost every day, except Sundays, when the priests are actually inside the church, actually doing their live streams from that area. Going back to something Jim said earlier, one of the big things is the HVAC system and watching the humidity. I mean, a lot of churches have a lot of artwork that we don't need to make sure that they get destroyed because of the lack of running our air conditioning or getting that humidity out of that building. And that's also for the organ also. So that's probably the big primary piece that we look at also is that humidity control around all the buildings that we have. We do have security 24/7 here to make sure that we don't have individuals come on campus for their safety, besides the safety of others if there's too much congregation that's on the area. We do let some small 12-step programs meet in some of our gardens. That's one of the good things that they're less than 10, and they're more than welcome. They stay there 6 feet in their distance away from each other, and that has worked out pretty good also. When we talked about the maintenance staff, it works really well with the rotation, so you don't have the same individual here all the time, and they don't get burned out in a very big and lonely place, being there doing their normal runs of anything from running water inside the sinks and stuff and everything to make sure that we're not getting anything that's backing up from the smells from the sewer systems and stuff like that. So there's nothing stops what we've been doing. So it works out really well.
Great.
Yeah, and one thing I would add to that is it's great to share resources if you can't support one particular individual. I think, as Bruce mentioned, you can rotate out the responsibility. But I also think what's important is you make sure that you have a consistent checklist so that people are reviewing the same things. And sometimes it's difficult where you overlook something that you should have checked. But while there's not a regular presence on site. It's making sure that those rotating people are looking at the same things and checking them off, that from week to week there are not issues that are springing up.
Great. So thanks so much for both of you for adding some more detail there. The other aspect that we talked about earlier in this presentation, and Bob hinted at in our opening, was that the parish may look closed because the building is mostly closed for most of your typical uses throughout the week, but you're not closed. You haven't necessarily gone away. You may be more of a virtual presence than a physical presence on site right now. So what's your challenge and opportunity here to remain really connected and engaged with the community? We think this is really important. Overall, throughout this crisis, one of the key ideas I think that's emerged in the work that Partners is doing to support parishes is that continuity is important. Reminding people that this is an interruption and it has taken attention, rightfully so, from the normal pattern of life that we have to focus on responding to this challenge and helping one another and being good neighbors to one another as institutions and individuals. We also need to really make sure that we can create some sense of continuity, and communication is important to that. Relationship and stewarding our relationships should still be at the forefront of what we're trying to do, especially when we all are feeling the challenge of being isolated. So what can you do with your building? There are still opportunities for people to be outside. And so one of the key ideas is you might use signage at your building to actually let people know where you are, to share a message about what you're doing, to redirect them to your online presence, or let them know how some of your activities may have shifted into a new form or been adapted. So that might actually be it sounds very old-fashioned, but it could actually be really helpful in this case. Obviously, social media and your website and other online communications are really important, not just for parishioners, but also for your friends and allies and people in the neighborhood who are connected to you in lots of different ways. And maybe you were a part of organizations or groups that used your space and are no longer meeting there because they can't meet there, but are still curious about where you are and what you're up to and when they might come back. So communicating in those ways is actually a really important opportunity here to stay in touch. Bob, would you add something? And I know Jim might want to share some particular stories as well too.
Well, I might just add that we work with somebody who used to work in the foundation world, and she often says to us that she finds a lot of older churches very imposing and forbidding. They're big stone brick buildings. It's not clear how you enter because the front doors are normally not open, right? There are multiple other doors. It's not clear what's happening in the building. It's not clear where the office is. So even under normal circumstances, a church can be forbidding and difficult to approach for someone who may have a question or may want to be involved in some way. And not just on Sunday morning, but throughout the week. And so I think even more so now that our buildings are mostly empty and people are not coming in and out all the time. So Joshua, you're correct. How can a church deliver the message that we are still there to serve? We're still a place of welcome, even though you may not be able to come in right at this moment. We still are eager to serve. We are eager to be in communication. I think like a banner, one of the easiest ways to communicate that you are alive and well is to work with a signage company or even do a homemade banner that you might string across the front door or the main entrance or where the parking lot is or in more than one place. And Jim, you were saying the other day that lighting is important too, because if you're not in the building, all the windows will be pretty dark. And if you don't light the grounds or if you don't light some of the spaces to make it look like you're still alive, it can give the impression that you are not alive. So maybe, Jim, you can add more on the question of lighting.
Yeah, well, I think, lighting has many purposes. One of them, obviously, is security. So that links to our conversation about keeping your building safe in these times where it's closed and trying to deter people from coming into the church when they shouldn't. But it also conveys that sense that, again, while the building is closed, the parish is open. And there's a sort of sense of welcoming, to see the exterior lights and maybe some strategic interior lights on, just to convey that, you know, the building is not completely dark and shut down. And I think that's a really important thing, not only for the people engaged with the parish, but also the community surrounding it. Mm-hmm. Just to say that, you know, that this building is still a welcoming building, and you know, obviously the lighting can help to accentuate the signage that's conveying messages. And although I've only had a few limited runs beyond the footprint of my home these days, the few that I have, I've seen a lot of places, restaurants, and other institutions who've put out a signage conveying what they're doing and how to further support them when you're out, and how to reach back into that community. So the lighting of the signage is really important for those who have wandered around, just to make sure they see that there's still a living, breathing community that supports the institution.
Bruce, I'm kind of curious, what is St. Martin's doing to let the Houston community know that you're alive and well? How are you handling that question?
We have outside signage around the church, but we also do a lot on our social media pieces to let everybody know. So it's on our web page or Facebook page. We stream on Facebook and YouTube for all our services. And at all those services, we talk about things that are taking place within the community.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Great. Well, that's really important. It's good to hear a lot of these different strategies, because we want to remind people that the church has not gone away, even if the appearance of the church is a little bit different than it is. So we don't see worshipers and community people streaming in and out of the doors every week. So one of the other things that we want to bring up is, obviously there's a lot to think about in taking care of a building that's mostly closed. And I think we've addressed a lot of those topics, and maybe a few more when we get into the Q&A. But the other opportunity here is, what can you do even if you're not able to gather for worship and all those typical things? So are there some opportunities here to use your building? You know, one of the things that comes to mind is some churches have land, for instance, and there might be passive recreation uses while people keep appropriate social distance. For instance, a lot of people are finding the need or the pressure to find space and be able to do recreation in the midst of their everyday cycle while remaining socially distant. There's lots of possibilities as well with public health, for instance, public health agencies. In many places, we are not reaching the same peak that we were maybe a few weeks ago. And so the need for field hospitals or other kinds of overflow healthcare facilities may not be as pressing right now. But we've seen in past disasters, churches have responded, working with Red Cross and hospitals to provide space for folk. And there have been some stories even in the national news about the possibility of churches doing that for this crisis. So there may be even others, like food delivery. I know that we've talked with churches, for instance, in rural areas, we're coordinating the gathering of food donations and meals for school children, for instance, who are not getting, in some rural districts, not getting a free lunch or free breakfast and lunch meals anymore because they're now home, they're not attending school, putting more pressure on their families. And so churches are helping as distribution sites, using parking lots and lawns and church kitchens and people keeping distance and having the right protocol in place. These are just a couple of the ones that I'm rattling off. I know that my colleagues will have lots of other examples, but we want to put that into play here and make sure that you are considering this. It could be a really important and valuable sort of step in the midst of this crisis, and one that could feel really meaningful, especially with the lack of not doing the things that you've done before and that you're so used to. This might be the opportunity to still feel really very connected, very helpful, and really show that you're a good neighbor and a great community asset for others in your community. So I want to turn it over to Bob and our other colleagues to jump in here and share some of their thoughts as well on this particular topic.
Well, I might just start by, and thank you, Joshua, that's well said. I think this is an opportunity to take a fresh look at what is remarkable about our buildings, what is special about their open space or their interior spaces, that might really offer something valuable to the community now. Joshua made allusion to working with the health system and during the height of the pandemic. And of course, we all read about St. John the Divine almost becoming another place for beds to be cited for Mount Sinai Hospital, which began with the dean of the cathedral talking to the head of Mount Sinai Hospital to begin to work that out. And they got pretty far along before they decided that the curve was going to flatten a little bit, so they might not need the space. I think one of the ideas that we wanted to suggest is that even though this is a scary time and we kind of feel like we're handcuffed a bit, it can be an opportunity to talk to our mayors or a city council person or a community foundation or a neighborhood group to say, hey, you know, we have a great kitchen, or we have a great parish hall, or we have open space here. Given what you're seeing in the community right now, because this pandemic may be leveling off a little bit, but it is not going away. And they're starting to say the fall may be worse than what we're having now. I mean, that's a scary thought, right? So given all that, can civic leaders suggest things that we can do, given the strengths and, as Joshua just said, the assets of our building? I think it's really an opportunity to reach out and say, you know, here is what we have. If you haven't been in our church in a while, we'll stand separate, 6 feet apart, but maybe we'll walk you through what we have, and maybe it'll suggest something that we could do on behalf of the larger community.
And if I just underscore something that Bob said, really think about your assets, what you have that's unique, that might be especially useful to some of the community organizations or institutions who might make use of it for some response or effort to help neighbors. There's a lot of need that this crisis particularly is highlighting. And how can your parish step in? And while you may not be able to use your building for the typical gatherings, if you know what you have, you can have the really successful conversations with those kinds of leaders to find an opportunity to put it into use. Jim and Bruce, would you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I would say just a couple of examples. The National Cathedral opened their doors to a blood drive run by the Red Cross. So it was a location and a resource that was convenient to the community, but they were able to sort of give the overlay of the appropriate health requirements to make sure that that happened. And it's a big open space. I mean, one of the things that I think the religious community can offer with their buildings is we tend to have sort of larger open spaces. Another thing that just came up in the local DC news is the need for providing large areas for people who need to self-isolate, who are in a home where they can't. So creating sort of 6 foot square footprint in larger spaces so that people actually can go someplace who are not hospital bound, but who have been identified with the virus and need to find someplace where they can separate from their families so they don't put their families at risk, so that they can isolate. And that was a sort of our community was looking for spaces that could offer that.
We too are using our facility for blood drive also.
Well, and this brings up another question. Jim, you were discussing this with us this week. In tandem with the question of using our building in new ways and maybe allowing people in carefully, we have to do this in a responsible way that may suggest a number of measures to make sure the space is safe and the people are being safe when they come in. And you raised some questions about the steps that a church might need to take as it welcomes some new things. Do you want to kind of walk through some of that with us?
Yeah, and by the way, I saw some questions crop up here about, we were talking about heating and cooling and humidity levels, and this sort of links to what you are suggesting, but there were, typically when you're mothballing your building, you want to, from a heating perspective, keep the heating at around 58 to 60, and in the cooling, keep it, 72 to 75, just so you're not getting extremes in temperatures and you're trying to reduce any interior condensation and the relative humidity. And I mention that only because moving forward, I think this virus is going to change how we think about larger spaces and how we ventilate them and how we filter them. So a lot of discussion in the design community and the historic preservation community about moving forward towards opening these buildings again. A lot of things they're learning about hospitals and how they're treating the spaces where COVID patients are. They're trying to create positive pressure and push air out so that there's not lingering contaminant in the air. And I think this is in a sort of trickle-down way going to feed to how we treat our buildings, how we address our filters, and how we turn over air within our spaces that was not necessarily a concern before. So that's one item. And then I think the other thing is, that in addition to sort of phasing in incrementally sizes, groups, and gatherings, I mean, we can't go from zero people in the church to 500 people in the church within a day. So somehow that will need to get mitigated. And also, I think we're going to need to think more clearly about how we clean our facilities moving forward and what that means and the rigor with which we clean. Churches are open to all kinds of communities and users. And I think we're going to need to be more thoughtful with our resources about how to make sure as people use the buildings and then exit that we are cleaning in a more diligent manner.
And Jim, you pointed out that churches may at some point, when new activities start to grow again, is that we may have to have at the entrances what shops now have, or restaurants, not restaurants, but grocery stores, which are gloves and masks and sanitizing materials so that people feel like they can come in, be safe, and not compromise anybody else's health. I don't know if any church has begun to do that yet. Anybody know of a case of that where churches are saying, all right, if you're coming in, you have to protect others as well as yourself?
Yeah, I'm not aware of it yet.
As we get back to normal or at least everyday use with more people gathered together, I think this is the kind of thing that we need to anticipate. And I think, Jim, your comments are really good at reminding us, what do we need to anticipate? In light of this, we may be out of a particular period of sheltering in place in a month or a couple months, but this might likely continue throughout the rest of the year, as Bob has sort of indicated as well. And so this might need us to shift overall the practices that we take in general. And you pointed that out, Jim, so well about HVAC issues. So coming on the other end of this crisis may be actually a bigger change in the way we do business every day. And so I think that's the important thing to think about as well, and to kind of anticipate some of these questions. How are we going to ease into doing this as well? So that's great. One last point that I want to emphasize, if I can, before we move into question and answers, is this need to continue stewarding your building and fundraising for it. Even though the building is closed and you're not showing up on Sunday morning, it does not mean that building costs have gone away. They may have changed. And yes, you may be seeing certain savings or efficiencies in your budget that are popping up because the building's not being used. Of course, building use affects the building costs, but the baseline is that building costs don't go away. Either for just taking care of it, if it's mothballed. Even a mothballed building needs resources to be taken care of and stewarded properly and well, and a building that's used minimally. And also our maintenance projects, our capital projects, buildings continue to need that. The weather continues to change. There are still seasons throughout the year, and those all put stress and onto your buildings. And so they all still need maintenance. So those needs are still there. And you need to remind people, and this might be really important to remind parishioners especially and donors, that your building is still there. You're still waiting to come back in full force, and it still has costs. And you might even remind them and be transparent. Transparency during this time is especially important, along with talking about finances in general, as they're going to change and adapt to this crisis. So make sure you remind people, we still have a building, it still has needs. Here are what the needs look like now. It might be a different pattern, and we still need your support to help take care of and steward this building appropriately. And that might be some new costs, as some of our speakers has kind of outlined, some new different things you might need to do to keep it safe and protected and throughout this period. Bob, would you like to add anything on this, or Jim?
I think that's well said.
Great.
Joshua, I think one of the things that probably Bruce and I should touch on is while we're in this period where the most churches are not actively being used, and if they are, it's mostly in a skeletal way with clergy providing video services within the parishes. It does give an opportunity for implementing things in a more fluid way than was otherwise possible. And I mention this because while I'm now at Smith Group, I was formerly at the cathedral, and I'm helping them with the renovation of a building adjacent to the cathedral. And one of the things we're talking about is utility work and trying to get utility work done on the campus. It's a 57-acre campus, and there's lots of traffic on a regular day in a normal world. And now we're in a zone where there's no traffic. So, I think it is important as we consider the care of our facilities that we take the opportunity for the resources that are available and the timing, if we can, and obviously if the funding is available, to try and implement things while there will not be interruptions of other kinds. So in some ways, try and make lemonade out of lemons to try and be both cost effective and lower the impact of logistics.
I think it would be good, in light of what you just said, Jim, Bruce, maybe you want to talk about some of the capital projects that are happening at St. Martin's and how that is playing out in the midst of all of this.
Well, we have a very large construction project that's going on, and it's encompassing the whole campus. So every building is being touched other than the church itself. So we have a preschool that's being touched. We have an old church that is being renovated. We have a new worship center being built, and also a new Sunday school class that are being built. And so the use of those buildings are constant, especially the ones that are being renovated right now. And it's so we do see a lot of in and out of inside those buildings. Primarily the space that's not being used is the parish hall and the youth center, along with the church itself. I mean, we miss our scouts. We have a scout building for individuals that's laying empty. But it's quite challenging that we're going through with the construction. It's very active here. The parking lot's full, so it looks like we're having church service every single day here.
Okay. Great. Well, thanks to all my colleagues here. I think we've covered a lot of the topics that we initially planned to address. But of course, the most valuable time, I always think, as a presenter is the Q&A. I always think that this is really where we have a lot of fun. So there are some questions here. I'm going to go through the chat box and kind of highlight some of the questions I think that are going to be really helpful for everybody to hear. The first one, which is the most recent, is a reiteration of maybe one more time for us to talk about ideal temperatures to keep in the building while they are quote unquote mothballed.
So yeah, just to repeat that, I saw several people ask that question. So in the heating season, you're looking to try and keep it around 58 to 60 degrees, and in the cooling season, about 72 to 75, and always trying to maintain a relative humidity of about 30%. And if you don't own a hygrometer, most people don't, but it is a great tool by which to measure your relative humidity inside your church, and that is something to keep watch of, because as I mentioned, as we move into the cooling season, out of the heating season, you just want to make sure you're not getting condensation that might result into mold buildup in your buildings as you're not using them.
That's the same standard that we look at too here at St. Martin's also.
I think one thing that I wanted to point out was a great comment from Megan Corbett. This was just to the panelists, but it was about her conversation with maintenance staff and how thrilled they were that people weren't actually in the building so they could catch up on projects that were on their punch list. I think that's a great comment. We talked about this in our panelist kind of prep discussion, and I think that's something that's really the idea that some of these maintenance projects might actually have a chance to get done now because people aren't using most of the spaces. So that's something to think about too.
Our construction guys are very happy because they're not being interrupted by funerals or weddings or anything like that. So there actually have been the most productive month was March and through the first 2 weeks of April here.
Great. Nancy had a, yes, Bob.
I just noticed 2 or 3 people asking about what are the standards for sanitizing space and helping people coming in and out being better protected. Are Jim and Bruce, are you aware of any government bodies that are putting out standards for nonprofits or civic organizations?
Not yet.
So
And
fast, maybe not.
Yeah, not yet. And it's going to be something that I think is going to be a real requirement moving forward, because there's got to be some guidelines by which people are making decisions, so that people feel safe again.
We have a question here from Nancy who, sorry, and Bruce, did you want to add anything to what Jim had just mentioned?
No, we don't have any guidelines either. I mean, we concentrate inside the church from the kneeler standpoint of the back portion of the pews, where people are putting up their arms in their praying stance that they put in. So it's important that those areas get wiped down really well, and we've done a really good job of sanitizing about every inch of the building we can.
So there are a couple of related questions here. So thank you, Bruce. There are a couple of related questions here from folk who are interested in your thoughts on security. And are there any particular services or tools, cameras, et cetera, that they might be able to use to keep an eye on the building 24/7, especially?
Well,
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jim.
I was going to say, I see somebody made the comment of the fact that they were able to get some low-cost cameras on the outside of the building. Cameras are great, but I think, as a lot of us have learned, and actually I spoke a little bit about this at the SEEP conference, cameras are reactive, not proactive. In other words, they will help you find out what happens, but unless you're sitting in front of your computer watching the camera 24/7, which most of us aren't, they're really only capturing what happened and visually serving as a deterrent, because if somebody sees a camera, they feel like they might be caught on video. I think there are other, I mentioned lighting before. Lighting is really huge. I mean, it not only conveys that the building is open, but it also conveys that people are illuminated and watched should something happen. So I think that's important regarding security. And then obviously, a lot of our churches have security systems. I know oftentimes those are the systems that are challenging to monitor and to keep up to date and functioning. Now's the time to make sure you've got those in place, because those are the monitoring devices that can trigger an alert as to whether somebody's trying to tamper with your doors and windows.
So there are a couple also, it looks like, oh, sorry, Bruce, do you want to add to what Jim just said?
No, I'm fine. The cameras are passive. You can't sit there and monitor them. It won't be very fruitful in what you're doing. Our cameras are all passive. When something does happen, then we go back and review it.
Okay. Bob, did you want to say something?
Well, I wanted to address the question that just came in about concern that vandalism could.
That's what I was going to. Yeah, there's a couple of related questions about that. So I think there's one question about vandalism to stained glass windows and what's the appropriate method to treat those. But there are a couple of earlier questions that are related around the larger topic of what happens if the building needs to be closed more longer term.
Right.
And are there any special ways to address that, or things that they should keep in mind? So I think those are all kind of related. Maybe we can address them together.
Right. Well, I'll start on the window question, which is a narrow question, and then maybe Jim and others can talk about the longer-term mothballing question. Generally, external glazing for stained glass is discouraged. It can do more harm than good, not just visually, but it can cause the heat buildup between the external glazing and the stained glass itself. However, if a building truly looks abandoned, that can invite people to try to break in. Or if there's truly a vandalism problem in a given neighborhood and people are throwing rocks or trying to break in, then you may need to consider something. And making sure that it's installed properly and vented properly is really important. Some stained glass companies, because it's highly lucrative, will push external glazing when it really isn't necessary. So I think it really depends on the situation. I would say if the danger is theoretical, then don't do it. But if you have serious reasons to be worried about people breaking through the glass, then I would consult with a good architect and or a good stained glass studio about doing it right. That would be my advice.
Yeah, Bob, I would agree with you. I mean, there are some ways in which you can put exterior glazing, whether it's plexi or glass in, that will work, but to your point, it has to be well ventilated and properly installed. I mean, it is an interesting point. I think I had mentioned when we were discussing this earlier, in my short stint going into the outside world from my home, I did go down to Georgetown in Washington, D.C., and there are a lot of stores, retail stores, who are not open because they're not essential businesses, and they have put protection over their windows and painted that out. I mean, that's certainly a path, but that's given that the churches are trying to convey a different community interest. I think it's probably the wrong message to put plywood over your windows and paint them. So Bob, to your point, I think you have to evaluate the risk and mitigate accordingly.
Right.
Yeah. I think there's a really interesting question here that's a little bit different from Kirk Berlenbach. And this question is about church community partners, organizations renting space in the church who are also not meeting and not active right now. And many of those might be asking for a cut or a deal break on their rental payments every month. And for some churches, that additional income is really important. That space use income is really important for their annual budgets. So the question here is, are there any thoughts about a strategy or an approach to fill the void that these organizations, that's made by these organizations' inability to really pay the full amount? Or are there any plans to help them ramp back up to making the payments and doing the rent income that is so helpful to the church? This is a really interesting and I think important, maybe overlooked in some cases, question. Bob, do you want to handle this first?
Well, I think, aren't we sympathetic to everybody? You know, we're sympathetic to the church that needs the income, and we're sympathetic to the nonprofit, often which operates on a shoestring. And if they're not there and can operate, then of course they don't want to pay rent or want to pay less rent. I think communication is the first step for everybody to talk together and say, hey, are we in it for the long term? And can we come up with some solution that helps us both out? Maybe there's a compromise. You know, one of the things we often say to parishes is that you need to be partnering with the folks that use your space, because it's not just about the rent. It's about the fact that if you're going to invest in your building, they should be your partners in that. If you're doing a capital campaign and reaching the community, they're your helpers. They're your partners in that. So maybe you compromise on the rent, but also talk about ways that they can help you invest in your building.
I think each situation is going to be different, so I'll jump in here too. I think every situation is going to be a little bit different, but there are a couple things to think about here, which could be very key. One of which is, you know, those organizations may feel the stress to maintain salaries or continue to pay staff, and so the rent needs to go away because that's an additional piece that takes some of the burden off of them. For instance, they may charge their own fees, like if it's a preschool or something like that, and they may be closed, or they may not be able to transition entirely to virtual, and so now they don't have fees, so they really have no income. And so there's not, I think what Bob is saying about a conversation is so important. What's this particular circumstance there? And the reason I think that that's also really important first step is the second part of the conversation, which is, well, what can we do here? Because that income that they give to the church it's not as though the church is necessarily a profit-making machine, right? That income helps the church take care of its historic, beautiful building, help pay its own staff, and add to its general operating budget. So I think in a conversation, it can be clear to say, what's your situation? This is our situation. We're struggling maybe to meet our budget or pay some of our key staff, and we don't really want to start pulling back on our commitments to folk as well. And there's this third part, which then is asking donors and letting donors know. Partners did a different webinar on capital campaign projects and sort of how those are going to be impacted by this crisis. And I think some of the things we talked about there are applicable here, which is let your donors know. And I think those organizations should let their donors know and remind their donors that the rent they pay is not just a fee, but is actually also supporting this great church that we all love, that our community loves, because it provides a home and a welcome place for everybody. So I think in the same way, and the church should tell its own donors, look, we may not be getting this additional income that's so helpful, but we need to ask you to be mindful of the fact that your generosity is especially crucial this time. So we're at about 4 o'clock now.
Can I just add one quick thing? One place to start in the conversation with those who use the space is talk about fixed costs versus variable costs, because it's true, you may not be needing to heat and cool the space as much. You may not need the sexton to clean the space, but there are fixed costs that you're encountering, and that may be a place to start in terms of finding a compromise.
That's right. So I think that we have come to the end of the time that we promised you and that we allotted for this conversation. I think it's been a lot of fun, really good questions. Wonderful to see all the people who were able to attend. I don't know if our friends from the SEEP Network have any parting words, but I would like to say thank you and all the best to everybody, and good luck and best wishes for the work that you're doing and everything that you're going to try and achieve and succeed following this. There will be, I think, a recording as well as the slides available. So check the SEEP Network website and you'll see the slides and a recording of this webinar. So thanks, everyone. All the best to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.